Welcome, everyone. My name is Sten Vermund. I serve as the Dean of the Yale School of Public Health. We're happy to invite our friends from the school, our other friends from the School of Medicine, School of Nursing, up campus, and the entire Yale community seeing this live streaming. John Kerry served as the 68th U.S. Secretary of State from 2013 to 2017. As our nation's chief diplomat, he guided the department's strategy on nuclear nonproliferation, combating radical extremism, and the threat of climate change. His tenure included the successful negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement. From 1985 to 2013, Secretary Kerry served as U.S. Senator from the state of Massachusetts and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from 2009 to 2013. Previously in U.S. Navy service, Lieutenant Kerry completed 2 combat tours of duty in Vietnam, for which he received a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with the Combat V device that refers to valor, and 3 Purple Hearts. He later was a leader in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. A graduate of Yale University and Boston College Law School, Secretary Kerry is now Yale's Distinguished Fellow for Global Affairs and the Visiting Distinguished Statesman for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Along with John Kerry, we have today's event moderator, our own beloved Dr. Robert Dubrow. I told you he was beloved. I don't get that. Rob is professor of epidemiology in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences and faculty director of the Yale School of Public Health Climate Change and Health Initiative. The initiative's activities include an online climate change and health certificate program for working professionals, membership in the Lancet Countdown Initiative, which is an important collaboration that issues annual reports on global progress in climate change and health, a Connecticut Countdown to track progress in Connecticut, and an emerging program on environmental and climate change justice, climate health justice. So we are very pleased to turn it over to Rob for his conversation with Secretary Kerry. And Secretary, we're very pleased you would come to the Yale School of Public Health for this event. Thank you.
Okay. So everyone here, okay? Okay, great. So first let me reiterate Sten's welcome. We're really thrilled to have you here. We know how precious your time is, and so thanks very much for spending this time with us. I thought that I'd start out asking the question, like, why are we having a conversation about climate change at a school of public health? You know, what does public health have to do with climate change? And just to set a context, I would contend that climate change policy is really public health policy, that public health and climate change are that intertwined. So why don't we start out, I thought, by maybe just getting your thoughts about that.
Well, I'm delighted to, Rob. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to be at what I just learned is the first public health school in the United States. Yay. This is enormously a matter of public health. Look, it's a matter of life and death, and it is simply not being met adequately, despite all of our efforts in Paris. So I've been 30 years at this or more. Al Gore, myself, Tim Wirth from Colorado, John Hines from Pennsylvania, John Chafee from Rhode Island, a few others. We're back in 1988 hosting Jim Hansen of NASA, who delivered the first news that climate change is happening now. That was 1988. In 1992, we went to Rio for the first Earth Summit, and George Herbert Walker Bush had the prescience to not only send his EPA administrator, Bill Riley, but to come to Rio. and sign an agreement, because we knew in 1992 that this was critical, that we needed to respond. And so we have traveled a journey since then of 1992 of having 24 conferences of the parties, the most recent ones in Katowice, Poland, the 24th. And the fact is, Rob, and this is a source of enormous frustration and even anger for me after all these years, and many of us, despite 24 conferences of the parties, despite the Paris Agreement, which brought 196 countries together with a target of aspirationally keeping the Earth's temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees centigrade certainly as a goal, despite the success of Katowice in most recently laying out rules of the road, and despite the world's best scientists, several thousand of them, agreeing that this is a matter of life and death and catastrophe in the making, despite growing evidence now that things are happening faster and with greater danger than ever imagined and predicted by these scientists. For instance, Greenland ice sheet is melting 4 times faster than it was 10 years ago. The oceans are warming 40% faster than they were 10 years ago. The cumulative evidence of disease spreading because it no longer dies off because it's warmer in certain environments, or of ticks in New England or elsewhere, living through the winter, and therefore more health cases. I mean, the potential of dislocation, despite knowledge of the potential of dislocation of massive populations, which is a health issue, despite the potential of huge food disruption, which is a health issue. You can run the list of transboundary disease, transboundary challenges for all of us, which is a national security issue as well as a health issue. Despite the best scientists in the world agreeing and warning us last year that we have a 12-year window within which we need to make certain we prevent that next 0.5 degrees centigrade, because the damage we see today is already happening at 1 degree. You go up 0.5, incrementally it's going to be that much greater in terms of the intensity of storms. We had Harvey, first storm in history to drop 5 days of water on Houston, which dropped more water in those 5 days than goes over Niagara Falls in an entire year. Irma, first hurricane in history to have sustained winds of 185 miles an hour for over 1 day, 24 hours. Never happened before. So I mean, I go on, there are a long list here, but so despite all of these things, Rob, we're not getting the job done. We are not getting the job done. And the simple reality is that we are, by acts of omission and commission, living out what I would call a mutual suicide pact. No exaggeration. Because of these massive changes that are going to take place on our planet. And we only have one planet. So we need to do what I think we did back in 1970, and I'm not retro. I'm not a guy who believes, everything that happened back in the late 1960s and 70s is nirvana, but I'll tell you what, we got some things done. And one of the things we got done in 1970, it was the first thing I did when I came back from Vietnam. I ultimately protested the war and led veterans against the war, but that wasn't the first thing I did. The first thing I did was involve myself in Earth Day, 1970. And we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on one single day, all of them together saying to their fellow Americans, we do not want to live next to the Woburn waste dump where you get cancer. We don't want to live next to a river that lights on fire, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. We don't want to be forced to drink water that gives us cancer. We don't want to live in a city where you can't see from one side of the city to the next. New York, Los Angeles, 1970. So what we did was not just bring 20 million people out, we made a political movement that targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress. And we went after them in the election. We made this a voting issue. And we defeated 7 of those 12 congressmen in that race. You know what happened? Clean Air Act passed. Safe Drinking Water Act passed. Marine Mammal Protection Act passed. Coastal Zone Management Act passed. And we put into law something we didn't have in America called the Environmental Protection Agency. And Richard Nixon, not a particularly known environmentalist, but nevertheless adequately cynical to take the moment, signed into law the Environmental Protection Agency, and we are where we are today because of that. So the point I'm making is we citizens have not made this the voting issue it needs to be. And the only solution I can think of now, because we're not getting the job done, big oil, big coal, big whatever, big money stands in the way of doing the things we need to do to be healthy and to make America safe and to make the world safe. So I think we actually have to now start to go back to the street, to go back to the activization of citizenship, to get people to make 2020 the year in which we tell politicians, if you're not prepared to vote for the things we need to do to have a sustainable green economy, you're out. That's simple, and that's the only thing I can think of that's going to save us from ourselves.
Okay, so
Sorry to be blunt, folks, but
no,
there's
so
no sense in having these meetings and no sense in my visiting you to talk if we don't talk about the reality, and that's the reality.
So I think you set the stage. Don't want to use the word beautifully because it's not a beautiful situation, but you set the stage
Yeah, but it's
very
a
well.
solvable situation,
Yeah.
Rob. That's the point. We should be optimistic because we're staring at the greatest market the world has ever seen. The solution to climate change is not some pie-in-the-sky thing that we're waiting to discover in 15 years, that we need the next Sergey Brin or Bill Gates to feed us. That's not what we're doing. We have those technologies. Now, they'll get better as we mobilize them, as we, in fact, produce the demand that the market has for this. But this is the largest market. It's a 4 to 5 billion user market today. It's going up to 9 billion users in the next 20, 30 years. And we have now solar, which is completely cheaper than coal by any measurement whatsoever, but particularly if you had an honest measurement of coal. Because nobody factors in when they say, oh, it's X cents per kilowatt hour. They don't tell you what the cost of a black lung is, but you guys in public health understand what it is. They don't tell you what the complications are to people with pulmonary disease. They don't tell you what the cost of coal is for the sludge and the dust that is now, because of specific regulations lifted by Trump, now going to be increasing in our lakes and streams. I mean, who is part of the constituency to increase coal sludge in lakes and streams and kill fish and water? But that's what Trump did. So when you add up the things that we look at that make a difference to people's lives, the reality is that we have a set of choices now. If you look at the real cost of coal just for transportation and for spillage and so forth, you look at the increased cancer from particulates. Largest cause of children being hospitalized in the summer in the United States of America is environmentally induced asthma. We spend $55 billion a year on that. They don't factor that into the cost of coal. So I'm telling you, solar is massively cheaper than coal. It's about 3 cents per kilowatt hour now. There are contracts being led at 2.9, et cetera, but we are still slow to take the old coal-fired power plants out of utility and put in their place some of the technologies that we have. I'm working with Vietnam right now to try to get Vietnam to move off of coal. And they have a virtuous cycle capacity because they have natural gas, they have solar, they have wind. They don't have enough of it, very much of it yet, and they have hydro. 45% of their energy base is hydro. So they could actually have a system where if you don't have sun and you don't have wind, you actually use your hydro more, you can balance your overall, and they have natural gas for a baseline conversion. So these things are doable, folks. It's not a question of a lack of capacity, it's a lack of political will to make the choices that we need. And in a democracy, when you have a lack of political will to do something, what do? You make it clear to people, this is what the people want, and if you don't do it, we'll find other people to give us what we want.
So to follow up on that, do you have ideas about how, so far, as you know, people, with some notable exceptions, politicians who make climate change a central issue haven't had a great deal of success, and that's exactly what we need. We need that success. We need people who advocate bold action on climate change to be elected. President like that, we need a Congress like that. Do you have suggestions for how do we turn that around, in terms of electing those sort of people?
I absolutely do. In fact, I'm working with former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz right now. I've been talking to people around the world about this. The former Prime Minister of Sweden has signed up, the former Prime Minister of Norway. We have Richard Branson, who's prepared to help us deal with certain kinds of public events, and we're targeting going out and organizing people towards a date to be set sometime next spring, in order to create a global day of action in which people commit to decades of action to get us to 2050, where we could have a low carbon, no carbon economy, which is achievable. Mm-hmm. You can't do it overnight, but if you determine that you want to do it, you can do it. That means electric vehicles, it means changing and doing it faster. If you're going to have electricity to do that, you have to build more electricity. So you have to figure out what's your more electricity base going to be created by. Obviously, you don't want it to be created by coal or fossil fuel. So you've got to move in a low carbon direction. I'm working with two former secretaries of state of the other party in order to figure out if we can agree on some kind of a carbon pricing mechanism, which I think is critical. James Baker and George Shultz. Yeah. And we agree on the principle of carbon pricing. We have to work on agreement on how you distribute some of the revenues that come from it, and do that in a way, and also deal with the regulatory process. So we're working on that. But I believe we have to go back into the street and turn it into a political movement. Now, why do I say that? I say that because in the last election, 2016, the current president was elected by 54.2% of the eligible voters in America voting. That's how many turned out. He wasn't elected by all of them. He was elected by, less than half of them, right, actually. Less than half of them in terms of popular vote. And obviously, the Electoral College did what it does. But I'm very familiar with that.
Yeah.
But 54.2%, the last time it was 54.2% was Al Gore in Florida, when, by the way, he did win the majority of the votes and they simply weren't counted. And we had a judicial intervention in our country, and people need to stop and think about that quite hard. That's just the reality of what happened. That never should have gone to the Supreme Court. States have the right to have oversight over their own elections, and to snatch it out of state jurisdiction and take it to the Supreme Court, as I speak as a lawyer, I think was a completely incorrect read of the law. But that's diverting. I divert.
So let me ask, go ahead.
No, I just finished the thought for you. So why am I so focused on this idea of voting? And I mentioned the 54%. Because when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, the turnout was 63.5%. Mm-hmm. When I ran against W in 2004, the turnout was 60.3%. In other words, that gap of 6, 7%, 8% is the difference, folks. I am convinced there is a massive majority in America a 68%, maybe higher majority in America for moving aggressively to deal with climate change. So it's a matter of voting. It's not something that's out of reach. And that's what people have to begin to believe in again. Everybody's patting themselves on the back and beating their chest about the great turnout that elected the largest new Congress since the Watergate Congress of 1974. Well, it's good. I'm delighted that we did. But you know what that turnout was? 49% of eligible voters. Young voters who have a particular stake in this. So many of you, most of you here. Young voters turned out, I hope the turnout here was much higher, but it went from 19, I'm talking about young voters, I'm talking about people 18 to 25. It went from 19%, 19.9% to 31%. So everybody's excited. 31%? Are you kidding me? What is going on? People sit there and say, oh, there's no difference between them. Tweedledee-dum, tweedledee. That's not true. It's just not true. And there is a profound difference in who controls the Senate, who controls the House, who has an ability to set the agenda, putting a bill on the floor of one of those institutions, standing up to a president. So I think, that's why I'm happy to come here today. This is one of the most important things I can be doing right now, I think, is talking to you about your obligation as citizens to live out the most important responsibility you have in a democracy, which is citizenship. We have to organize, we have to go street for street, house for house, we have to get people out to vote, and we will reclaim our future, I guarantee you. But if there's an indifference, people would rather be video gaming or going to flick or doing something, we're in trouble. And right now, things are not very encouraging in terms of our ability to get the job done when you look at what's happening in Italy, France, Germany, Britain, Hungary, Middle East, and various parts of the world. There's a crisis of governance globally right now. And the best accountability in that kind of crisis is the light and accountability that comes from people participating in the system and deciding to make their vote count.
So electoral politics is key. Do you see?
Well, not just electoral, but
Right.
you can do it in NGO type efforts. You can do it in organizing. You have, I think it's better to do it in the political process, but there are lots of ways to contribute to changing the dialogue, to having an impact on people's thinking, making sure we actually have a baseline of facts in America. It's very hard to run a democracy when you can't agree on what the basic facts are. And if you can't agree on the basic facts, you can't build consensus. That's kind of where we are right now, folks. And if you have a presidency itself that's talking about alternative facts, well, we have far more of a problem than George Orwell thought we would.
Yeah. So I wanted to follow up on that, to ask you maybe about a few specific tactics that people who are working on climate change are using, and just to see what you think of those. And so the first I'll ask about, since it's kind of, it's happening at Yale, is divestment from the fossil fuel industry, and what you think about that as a tactic to try to make progress on climate change and maybe kind of...
I think any manifestation of dissent and of the need for a new and compelling agenda is important, and I welcome that. Do I think it's a game changer or that it's going to make the difference? The answer is no. Mm-hmm. It'll have an impact, but the problem with it is it doesn't amount to the kind of impact that divestment did have in South Africa, for instance, when we were all involved in trying to break down apartheid. And it had a profound impact because it was countries all over the place that did it. I don't see, given that you have a lot of oil-producing countries who will buy their own stock, and others, I don't think it gets you where you need to go. It's a statement. Mm-hmm. I welcome the statement, but someone else is going to buy that stock,
right?
And it's not going to change the dynamic.
Yeah, I think it's probably more awareness building than it's going to really have an effect on finances.
Totally.
Yeah.
I agree. And in that sense, I certainly welcome people.
Yeah, I mean, it's one tactic. Another one I wanted to ask you about is like, so, and my wife's been involved with this, and she's actually been arrested several times in nonviolent civil disobedience trying to stop gas pipelines. The thinking being that there's billions and billions of dollars going into building up fossil fuel infrastructure that's not meant to last just 5 or 10 years. It's meant to last 30, 40 years, and which we just can't be doing. That money should be going into renewable energy. So I'm just wondering what you think about, you know, those movements that are trying to stop.
Well, I think people will make those choices and need to make those choices. I have been civilly disobedient. I've been arrested. And it's a choice people make. I don't go out and, you know, I'm not, I think there are other choices I'd rather people make right now in terms of spending their energy and their time. I'd rather not have them be in jail, rather have them be on the street organizing and doing other things. But it makes a point also, we've got to convince people. But I think right now, there may be better ways to be convincing people. But you know, those pipelines should not be built right now. So if people want to make the decision that they're going to put themselves on the line,
yeah, and there's also
we in the Obama administration, I actually signed off against the building of the Keystone Pipe for that reason, because I thought it was not appropriate in a world where we needed to be making different choices for us to be funding something which was such profoundly, you know, wrong and antiquated choice.
Yeah, and actually, there's a whole range of tactics against the pipeline. So it's the nonviolent civil disobedience is at one end, and then there's also kind of, you know, legal action and trying to take regulatory steps and
all
that
of
sort
which
of thing, the whole
is
spectrum.
spectacular. I was flying back from Europe just the other day. I was at the Munich Security Conference. I had time to watch RBG. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but what a spectacular demonstration of one person's ability to use the law to be able to change things.
Right, and then the next tactic I wanted to bring up is actually a legal tactic, which is, are you familiar with Juliana versus the US? So there are 21, this is a case that's in the federal court in Oregon. It's been around for a few years now. 21 youth have sued the US government. I mean, youth, like 13-year-olds.
This is the case for tort.
Yeah, that's
damages.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with that. Boy, am I 100%. I think Donald Trump ought to be sued for the fact that the decision he has made with respect to climate and pulling out of climate change is going to kill people and cost billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And he ought to be held accountable for such a stupid decision.
Yeah. So let me turn now to...
And there may be other legal challenges coming along those lines also.
Yeah, I know. Groups like Earth Justice are really thinking about how to move things forward in the
For instance,
legal
there's evidence to some degree about some big energy corporations hiding the knowledge they had of their own scientists, telling them internally about the advent of climate change and the consequences of doing what they're doing. And they kind of pushed it under the table. It's very much similar to the R.J. Reynolds and tobacco lawsuits. And there's obviously a health issue, and this is related to it. This damages human beings. The sources we are choosing and the methods we are choosing to fuel our marketplace, which I think is important if done properly, obviously, but our capitalism has gotten warped. I'm a capitalist, but I'm not a robber baron capitalist. I'm what I hope is called a thoughtful, progressive capitalist who believes capitalism can return more of its investment to people. And it's the age-old struggle between labor and the fruits of that labor. Yeah. And right now, the reason we have Donald Trump is because a whole bunch of Americans are dissatisfied with their lives because they haven't been getting enough of the benefits of globalization and of trade and of the work they do. And they've seen a callousness in the way in which some of those jobs have been driven to other countries, and they've been left hanging at age 50 or whatever, unable to get further employment. That anger is you shouldn't be involved in public life if you don't understand that anger today. That's what's fueling dissatisfaction around the world. And the response to it is not to become autocratic and crush democracy. The response to it ought to be to make sure people's wages are fair, to make sure they've got health care, to make sure that, you're not depriving, I mean, you're not weighing people down with loans that are so cumbersome for the rest of your life that you never get out from under because you wanted to get an education. Sure. I mean, these things would make more difference to the quality of life in our country and the readiness of people to make some of the decisions we need to make to deploy new technologies. Mm-hmm. But we're moving in the wrong direction, and it's pretty scary when you look at some of the nations in the world that have a bad history when you have economic dislocation, demagoguery, and sectarian and religious discrimination. That combination has had a very bad history in the last century, as we all know. And there are some very foreboding indicators of a return to that kind of anger and blaming other people for things that they're not to blame for.
Let me turn to one other topic, and then I think we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So the topic is getting back to the Paris Agreement. And thank you for all the work that you did on the Paris Agreement, because with all its flaws, it was obviously a big step forward. It was laying the basis, hopefully, for progress.
Well, that was the purpose of it, Rob. I mean, the purpose of Paris, I said to the plenary session in Paris after we passed it, right after there was euphoria and everybody was elated, because it was the first time we had that kind of a global agreement. But I said to everybody, you know, nobody should fool themselves into believing that we're leaving here having met the task of guaranteeing we're holding the Earth's temperature to a rise of 2 degrees centigrade. What we are doing is sending a message to the marketplace simultaneously that every one of 196 countries are agreeing they are going to move in this direction to reduce emissions. And that message to the marketplace will affect the allocation of capital. It will decide many people's desire about where they'll invest their money. Because, oh my, there's this big market out there. Well, it worked. For the first year, $358 billion went into alternative, renewable, sustainable energy development. This is the first time ever that more money was invested on the planet in sustainable fuel rather than in fossil fuel. So we're on the right track. Yeah. But then Trump pulls out, and now other countries are saying, well, if the United States doesn't care, why should we make it a burden? That's why I say we're on a mutual suicide track, because by not doing the things we should be doing, we are guaranteeing this 0.5 degrees, and scientists are telling us that means greater storms, more floods, greater damaged property, more disease, all the things that we know we're trying to avoid. And I get so angry. For the life of me, I don't understand. Well, I do understand it's money and power, but it's incomprehensible to me that facing the evidence we face about what will happen, that people are not prepared to make decisions that actually open up infinite economic opportunity. I mean, the fastest growing job in America today is solar power technician. There are 300,000 of them. There are only 50,000 or so people in the coal industry. Wind power technician, second fastest growing job in America. They could be even growing faster, folks. We could be rebuilding, all kinds of, we don't even have a national energy grid in the United States of America. We live in a country, we went to the moon, we are the people who invent the internet. We're curing diseases we've never thought we'd cure. But we do not have an energy grid for our nation where we could send sustainable energy from one part of the country to another. That's insanity. And so, we're not building anything in America. Can any of you here name one single national infrastructure project? The governor of California just had to scale back on high-speed rail. We're not building anything the way we used to build it. We got the Acela. I rode on a train in Beijing that went 300 kilometers an hour. And the guy put a glass of water on my table. It didn't even move that much. So help me God, at 300 kilometers an hour. Half hour, Beijing to the coastline. What do we, I mean, really, the Acela, think about it. It can go 150 miles an hour, you know, and the route from Washington to New York, it goes over 150, I think exactly 18 miles of the whole trip.
Yeah. I think it averages like around 65.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Can't go fast under the Baltimore Tunnel,
Right.
because if you go fast under the Baltimore Tunnel, the tunnel will cave in.
Right.
You can't go fast over the bridges of the Chesapeake, because if you do, you'll wind up in the Chesapeake. This is nonsense. I think most Americans, if given the opportunity, would love to be building things. You know what I'd love to see? I'd love to see the highway out here, 95, as it comes through New Haven. I'd love to, I talked about this with Senator Lieberman 10 years ago or something. You should do here in Connecticut what we did in Massachusetts when we got rid of the green monster running right through the center of Boston. We tore it down, we built a tunnel. Yeah, it cost $15 billion, but that's the federalism. That's what you do in America to profit everybody. And the result is we connected our city to the water. Imagine what would happen here in New Haven if you had land up there and connected to the harbor, ultimately got rid of those gas tanks and created value and property, and Yale expands and everybody expands and is happy and we do better.
Powered with renewable energy, yeah.
Not everybody would be happy, but I just think that this lack of desire to do things in our country is really costing us. And by the way, it's not making America first, it's making America last in a lot of different things that make a difference to the quality of life of our citizens.
Right. So why don't we open it up now for questions from the audience? And there, people have, the mic people maybe could, so the way to do it so we don't have a lot of dead time is let's start with someone on this side, and then while this, and be ready on that side with another person, so we could go back and forth like that. So it's right here? Okay, great.
Thanks.
And maybe please introduce yourself and say, you know, what, if you're a student or whatever. Yeah.
I'm Julie Parr. I'm a staff member in the development office, actually, at the School of Medicine. And in 2004, my cousin Lori Sheldon asked you a question in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, during your presidential campaign.
And you're asking me if I remember the question.
No, you took her on the campaign trail with you, and the question was about employment in that region. She met John Bon Jovi and flew in the plane with you, and it was a very big moment for her, and you made a big difference for her personally.
So you're trying to bum a ride with John Bon Jovi?
I want to thank you for that, but also she's from the Rust Belt region and an area that has been devastated, has no jobs, and that's what she asked about then. And the issue still remains. Of course, fracking is now a big issue, you know, an employer and generating money in those areas. And people in the areas are extremely excited about it. But could you speak to how the Green New Deal or something like it would be able to positively impact the areas that you mentioned of our country that are left behind by employment and global trade?
Building, excuse me, everybody will need energy. And our development and our growth will depend to some degree, not to some degree, it depends. It's a critical component of growth. As you grow your population, as you grow your communities, as you renew your communities, you want to try to do it in a way that's very sensible. There's massive amount of gain to be achieved in terms of energy savings and efficiency by redoing buildings, by building buildings differently, by setting up new standards for the kind of materials we use, how we heat, how we warm, how we cool, all these things. But as we shift, that creates new industry. Those are new jobs. It's not unlike the transition America has always gone through. Back in the early 1900s, 50% of America worked in agriculture. Today, it's about 1.5% that works in agriculture. But we're at 3.7% or so unemployment. So we've got almost full employment, even as you are transitioning in our economy. And the question is, can we focus marrying people's skill sets with the opportunities more effectively? Community colleges do this pretty effectively. I think it's a terrific system. We have to do more to make sure we're training people for real jobs that are out there and higher level jobs that are paying people enough that you could actually support your family based on one job. And sort of that ought to be the vision of the future. Now, Maine has always been really down on the economic ladder in terms of comparative to the rest of the country. It's low cost living, but it's also very low cost pay and job opportunities. That can change with new energy opportunities, which are all very, very possible. It can also change with new construction materials or with new construction methodologies. That's what's going to happen as we go forward. We're not going to chop down all our forests, I hope and pray. We're going to have, I've seen people already, companies that are now doing artificial wood. Looks just, things are going to change as we go forward in life. And I think Maine and other areas can. What? It was in Pennsylvania. Oh, Western Pennsylvania. Well, Western Pennsylvania fracking is a big issue. My wife obviously lives out that way, and our family's been very concerned about it. I'm worried about the fact that people don't know where the fracking is going and what the fracking elements are. And it just seems like common sense to me. I've read all the data. I've had company executives tell me, no, we track it, we know where it's going. But guys, geology is geology. There are crevices underneath. There are passages we don't know about. There are ways in which certain materials are ultimately going to flow somewhere. This is what Rachel Carson wrote about in 1962. It's what inspired all of us to become involved. I mean, I matriculated as a freshman in 1962. And that's when the Silent Spring hit, and we all said, whoa, this is happening around us, and that's what fueled the environment movement. That's why I'm so committed to this notion that we can refuel it again today, perhaps even more easily because of social media, because of smartphones' ability to communicate. We ought to be able to mobilize people sufficiently to hold the politicians accountable. And I am worried about, I do not accept the assurances at face value that the materials being used in fracking are not worth being concerned about from a health point of view.
On that side now?
Hi, Secretary Kerry. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the Green New Deal and how it's moving through Congress now and its political fate, perhaps, from your perspective.
Well, I think, first of all, I welcome all new ideas, and I welcome people who want to push the envelope of thinking what's possible. When you talk to very practical people who know more than I do about the pace at which you can do certain things technologically, I'm talking about John Holdren, the former science advisor to President Obama, or Ernie Moniz, the former Secretary of Energy, who I talk with frequently about this kind of stuff. It's just, it's reaching perhaps a little bit too fast, too far, but there's no harm in putting, we should be encouraging people to put big ideas out and to fight about not whether we ought to be doing something, but how we ought to be doing it. So I think it's very welcome in terms of the debate. Ernie Moniz and I are working right now in this context of trying to give shape to this idea of moving towards this day of action, towards decades of action, of being quite specific about the things that we think are achievable in a period of time. And the reason I say a day of action next year for days of action is this. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, have a target date of 2030 for metrics for measurement. The Paris Climate Agreement has a target of 2030 for a time of metric. It's also 2050. 2050 is a reasonable target for making a judgment that we could get to a low energy, to a low carbon, no carbon economy. It would require to meet the 1.5 degree standard, we'd have to have about a 45% reduction over the period of time between now and then. To achieve a 2 degrees, we would have to have about a 20% reduction over a similar period of time.
It's a 2030.
2030.
Yeah, 45%.
Correct. Yeah,
Each
2030.
of those are to 2030,
So,
yeah.
yes, by 2030. By 2050, you'd have to hit your no carbon, low carbon. But to get to that, you have to achieve one of these benchmarks by 2030. So we're looking at that and saying, okay, one day of action. We're looking for people to build up towards it, to begin to do individual things in their communities, to have things they can brag about and talk about that they're doing, share it on a global site, which we will believe will be climateclearinghouse.com if all comes to fruition. And everybody in the world will be sharing things on this site, helping to build the energy for what can happen community to community, et cetera. And then when you come out, you know, we're talking about the potential. We're not locked into this of having a Live Aid type series of venues across the world where people will come to join in a global effort to underscore that we're making this a political movement, that in every country that has an election will make this issue an election issue, and where you don't have an election, you will be trying to pressure government to be responsive. So I think that's the best way to try to fight for change, folks, and that's sort of part of it, and I think the Green New Deal will add impetus to that, but I hope also that what Ernie and I and others put on the table will also add to the debate. And we have to be clear, folks, the IPC scientists, the UN scientists, in their warning to us about curbing the 0.5 degrees, were crystal clear that to achieve this, it will take historic, unprecedented steps. So I'm for people putting historic, unprecedented steps on the table.
Yeah, over here.
Hi, thank you so much for talking with us today. I'm Tanya, I'm a graduate student. And the question I have is, how can we help young people better connect and engage with these issues on climate change that we're talking about today?
Well, young people are the key to this. And I mean, I think we have to just go into high schools and go into colleges and universities all across the country. That's what we did back. I mean, I'm not relying on retro concepts here. But during the Vietnam War, we had a lot of teach-ins across America. And we brought people to campuses. We don't have to do that as much today because with live streaming, you can take one venue and put it everywhere. But we need to do that. We need to educate people. We need to inspire people to recognize their own power, to make a difference. Historically, it has always been young people who are at the center of a movement for change. And that has to happen now also. To wit, you know, when I was an undergraduate here, 1963, we had buses lined up on High Street, and Yale students got in them and went down south to help break the back of Jim Crow by being involved in the Mississippi voter registration drive. We had people who became part of the women's movement, which reached new heights during the late 1960s, early 70s. And the Equal Rights Amendment was being debated and fought for. And you know, there was the initial battle over voting rights, 1964, 65. Again, young people responding. The anti-war movement was fueled by young people demonstrating. So I think how were we inspired to do that? Because leaders stood up and inspired us. I remember Allard Lowenstein became a congressman, and he was a great organizer. He was really just an organizer more than anything, but he finally ran for Congress. But he was the person who urged Robert Kennedy to run for president and became centrally involved in both the anti-war and civil rights movement and other things. I think it was in the Battelle Chapel or it might have been somewhere on the old campus. I remember hearing the single most inspirational speech I'd ever heard as a young person at that point in time, and it fueled in me a readiness to go out and be part of that when I came back from Vietnam. So that's the difference. And it requires some young leaders, doesn't have to be young to hopefully convey the truth and inspire people to do it, but we've got to get people out. People went up to New Hampshire, 1968. Gene McCarthy, Senator Gene McCarthy from Minnesota, decided to run against Lyndon Johnson, who was then President of the United States. Improbable task, but he went up to New Hampshire. Young people went up there with him, concerned about the war. And they were called the Peanut Butter and Jelly Brigade because they lived off peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, living 20 people to an apartment. And Gene McCarthy got 44% of the vote, not a win, but it was a win. It was enough that Lyndon Johnson knew he had a problem and couldn't run for president of the United States again. Declared 2 weeks later he wasn't going to run, would devote himself to being president, and Bobby Kennedy jumped in the race, and the rest we all know is history. So I think it's a matter of perhaps conveying to people by going and talking to them and talking about the facts as I have here, I hope today, adequately, to inspire you to say, you know what, I got to get off my ass and go out there and do something. I got to make a difference because this is vital to me. And by the way, vital to me, I mean vital to you. You decide it's vital to you. Because if we have the kind of dislocation that scientists are telling us we might have, will have, and if you measure what is happening today against what was predicted 5 and 10 years ago, it's all happening faster, it's all happening bigger. And if you put that together and just use your common sense to apply a sort of precautionary principle to the choices that you make, you should decide, you know what, I gotta go out and make the system work. I gotta go out and be part of this. I guarantee you, if enough people think that way, we're going to win back our future. We're going to change it. So that's part of the movement that I'm talking about. Right now it's tentatively called One Planet. You're getting this, folks, fresh off the presses because Ernie and I started talking about this in Munich at the Munich Security Conference last weekend. And we're literally meeting tomorrow in Boston, and we're going to flesh it out more. We're working with other people. But our theory is that if we can begin to get people working on specific tasks and sharing those, and they replicate them, you build out a movement where everybody has feeling a sense of stake in it. And it's called One Planet Action. And as of now, we have reserved the domain, and we'll see whether or not it becomes a reality. But my hope is that we can rekindle the vitality of our own democracy, which, by the way, is troubled. And I ask you all to think back, but recall your history books. When our founding fathers were working in Philadelphia during that long, hot summer of the late 1800s when they were rewriting the Constitution of the United States, when they finally finished their work, Benjamin Franklin walked out of Constitution Hall and down the steps, and there was a crowd that was gathered there, and a woman shouted at him, said, "Dr. Franklin, tell us, what do we have, monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." I've never seen our republic as basically fundamentally challenged as it is right now by the illegality, criminality, lack of ethics, the lack of process, the lack of respect for our institutions that we are seeing from this administration in Washington. It's serious business. And if we care about our republic and we want to be an example to the world, we all need to go out and work.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up. So,
we got one up in the balcony. Let's give the nosebleed audience here. Right.
Jimmy Carter wore a sweater, if I remember correctly, on national TV. What can we do to have the average person conserve both energy and decrease materialism so we don't continue burning up
Well, you know, we are America, and you can't force people to do things. You can provide incentives for people to do things. You can provide economic incentives. You can provide legal incentives. You can provide inspiration. And I think we need to get, I mean, efficiency, by the way, if more people would talk about it, it makes sense for every home because you save money. There's a Greek immigrant in Massachusetts who started a business, I don't know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, where he goes to businesses and he says to them, you don't have to put up any money. I'm going to come in here and finance refitting your building. And I'm going to save you X amount per year on your building, and you're going to pay me for my service of doing that by giving you a percentage of your savings for the following thing. They sign a contract. He makes incredible amounts of money, and nobody has to lay out the funds to do it. He's now a multimillionaire, and he's got a hell of a company. So that's an incentive. That's a way to do things. If we made energy efficiency a greater incentive. Now, part of what will make it an incentive is pricing carbon. Mm-hmm. You price carbon and people will begin to make different choices. And so you can legislate that particular pricing, and we should, I believe, and do it in a way that does not put not any burden, additional burden on poor people, but begins to cut in at a place where people are comfortable, that families will not be negatively affected, and that you can afford it. Now, that's doable. And that's the kind of thing I think we need to do, is put real incentives into the economy and into the system for a different behavior. People will make better choices as electric cars come down in price, which they will, as technology moves forward and Moore's Law cuts in. And, you know, there's always a progression of reduction there, and I'm confident that will take place. So you all, each of you, I mean, one of the things you can do is task yourself to come up with something your community might think of doing that would inspire people and lower the costs, et cetera. You know, maybe the School of Public Health ought to think about having a program here where those of you in public administrative component of it, or people who are med school or whatever component of health is being taught, you're going out to some of the high schools in the region here. You know, go talk to different levels of classes, hold a seminar. You know, there's all kinds of spontaneous combustion that can go to work to affect the inspiration necessary here. But there's nothing, I think, in the end that works like seeing millions of other people on the same day marching with you in concert to make something happen that everybody really knows matters.
Okay. So before we wrap up, I wanted to thank a few people. It took a lot of work to make this event possible. So I wanted to thank Saskia Gomez, Safo Gilbert, Sona Lim, Mike Skineski, Martin Klein, Dean Vermund, Connie Evans, and Michael Greenwood for all the work they've done to help organize this event. So one thing that I've noticed about public health students, and a lot of the people in the audience are obviously public health students, is that most people don't go into public health to become millionaires. And the reason most of you go into public health is because you want to build a better world. And so I'd like to thank you, Secretary Kerry. I think you've really helped to inspire the students in the room toward that end.
Can I mention one thing? Thank you, Rob, very, very much. I just want to leave you with one last thought. Also talk about inspiration. My daughter, who is a Yale undergrad, is now a physician in Boston at Mass General. And she started a program called SEED Global Health, S-E-E-D Global Health. And it's training, building healthcare capacity in 5 African countries, even while she is practicing medicine at MGH and raising 2 kids. So I use her as an example of, you know, you can multitask and get involved in these things and make a difference. In fact, I'm going to have her come down and teach one of my classes over on public health challenge in terms of diplomacy and international affairs, which figures very significantly nowadays, was Ebola, AIDS in Africa. We're on the brink of having the first generation of children born AIDS-free in Africa, and the reason is PEPFAR, the American taxpayer, and our willingness to organize it and be involved. Similarly on Ebola, I remember sitting in the Situation Room at the White House when we were briefed by public health folks, being told that 1 million people were going to die between September and December I think it was 2015, I think it was. And we sat there with President Obama listening to this briefing, and we did not know what we did not know. But we had to make decisions. The president sent 4,000 American troops to West Africa. We worked with the British and French. We took a country. We built healthcare delivery capacity, and we stopped pandemic. Now, again, there's Ebola in Congo. And the response has been, while initially appropriate, now just sort of retreating and pulling back and inadequate. And I've just written an op-ed, which I hope someone will print with Vanessa, my daughter, in the last day or so. We'll see what happens. But I leave you with this thought, everybody. I know it's daunting. I know it sounds daunting, and everybody says, oh my God, can I really make this difference? The answer is yes, you really, really can. And you really must. And if you look, through the course of history, improbable things happen when improbable moments take place. Lech Walesa jumping over a fence in Poland to become part of a demonstration. He just saw it going on. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he did. He became part of it, and guess what? He became president of the country, created a revolution and change. And Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison, 27 years, never gave up, never stopped, but when he came out, he hugged his jailer and he hired his jailer to become his personal guard, and he lived with him until the day that he passed away. And I met with Mandela a couple of times, and I always remember one thing he said, which I commend to you. He said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." Let's get it done. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, great job.